The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of bland, sun-drenched San Francisco day that held no premonition of the seismic shift about to fracture her world. Eleanor was humming an old tune, one she used to sing to a young Daniel when he couldn't sleep, a melody woven into the very fabric of their shared past. Her hands, now lined with the delicate maps of her 71 years, were dusted with flour as she gently shaped the dough for his favorite sourdough. The entire Victorian house on Steiner Street, a home she had shared with her late husband Robert and filled with the echoes of their son's laughter, seemed to breathe in a deep, contented sigh. It smelled of yeast, of simmering tomato sauce for the rehearsal dinner she'd painstakingly planned, and of a profound maternal anticipation that felt as tangible as the warm, springy dough beneath her fingers. This was the joy she had cultivated since Robert's passing, a quiet, persistent melody built not from grand gestures, but from small, deliberate acts of love. Today, that melody swelled into a full orchestra. The pale lavender dress, a reckless, beautiful $250 splurge from a little boutique in Union Square she'd passed for years, hung in pristine solitude in her closet, its silk whispering promises of a mother's pride, of her place beside her son on his most important day. New shoes, a matching clutch she'd found on sale, everything was ready. On her nightstand, a crisp $1,000 check written from her dwindling rainy day fund, money Robert had always insisted she keep for herself, waited in a card filled with her looping, heartfelt script. To my dearest Daniel and Chloe, she had written, "May your life together be as joyful as you have made mine. With all my love, Mom." She had even called her sister, Sarah, in Chicago last week, their conversation a burst of excited laughter and shared nostalgia. "My little boy," Eleanor had whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that was equal parts joy and loss. "I can't believe it's finally here. Robert would be so proud." She wiped her hands on her checkered apron, a genuine, unforced smile gracing her lips as she picked up the humming phone. "Daniel, sweetheart, I was just thinking of you, perfecting your recipe. I hope Chloe's parents are ready for a real San Francisco sourdough. I'm using the starter your father loved." There was a beat of silence, a hollow, echoing void where her son's cheerful, familiar voice should have been. Then a sound that was not her son's voice. It was Chloe's voice, smooth as polished marble and just as cold, seeping through the line like a draft. "Eleanor, we need to talk." The smile on her face didn't vanish. It simply froze, a fragile mask over a sudden, skittering fear. "Chloe, is everything all right? Put Daniel on." A sliver of ice, thin and sharp, pricked at her heart. Her mind, a mother's mind, instantly conjured calamity. A car accident? An illness? Had he lost his job? "He's right here." Another pause, heavy and deliberate, and Eleanor could picture them with painful clarity, huddled over the speakerphone in the sleek, high-ceilinged apartment she paid for in Hayes Valley, surrounded by the minimalist furniture she had bought from Design Within Reach, lounging on the $2,000 sofa she had financed because Chloe insisted it was the only one that truly complemented the space. We didn't want you to hear this from someone else." A deep breath, theatrical and drawn out. "We got married." A wave of pure, unadulterated joy, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over Eleanor, momentarily melting the ice in her veins. It was happening! They'd eloped! How romantic, how spontaneous! "You did? Oh, my darlings! Congratulations!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with happy tears she could already feel forming. "But when is the ceremony? I have my dress. I've spoken to your Aunt Sarah. She's booking her flight. We were going to have such a celebration. I've already made the sauce." "No, Eleanor," Chloe interrupted.
her voice sharp enough to slice through Eleanor's bubbling excitement like a shard of glass. "We got married yesterday." The world did not slow down. It stopped. The gentle hum of the sub-zero refrigerator faded into nothingness. The dust motes, once dancing a joyful waltz in the sunbeam through the bay window, seemed to hang suspended in the air, frozen mid-pirouette. Yesterday. The word detonated in the silence of her spotless kitchen, its shockwave obliterating every carefully laid plan, every cherished expectation, every quiet dream she had nurtured in the secret chambers of her heart. Yesterday. She had spent the previous day right here, cleaning this house with a fervor she hadn't mustered in years. She had polished the silver cake server she hadn't used since Robert's last birthday dinner, fluffed every cushion on the porch swing, imagining them here after the City Hall ceremony, toasting with the bottle of Dom Perignon she had chilling in the refrigerator, a foolish, wonderful extravagance for her boy, her only child. She had even bought a new guest book, just in case. "Yesterday?" Eleanor whispered, the word feeling alien and clumsy on her tongue, a relic from a language she no longer understood. "It was an intimate thing," Daniel's voice finally cut in, strained, rehearsed, and utterly devoid of the unbridled happiness a new groom should possess. It was the voice of a man reading from a legal document, a prepared statement. It was very small, just the two of us.
The wedding was intimate for us and the witnesses. We didn't want the stress and drama of a big production, Mom. You know how Chloe gets." Eleanor's knees buckled. She groped blindly for the solidity of the kitchen counter, her flour-dusted fingers leaving ghostly white prints on the cool black granite. "You know how Chloe gets." The words were a shield, flimsy and transparent, and he was hiding behind them. She had spent 3 years accommodating how Chloe gets, smoothing over every financial crisis, every emotional storm, every urgent need that somehow always required her checkbook to solve. She had been the calm port in their perpetual chaos, and now her reward was to be excluded from their calm. "I see," she said, though the room was tilting, and she saw nothing but a blur of betrayal. The flour on her hands felt like the ashes of her own expectations. I'm happy for you." The lie tasted like ash, too. It was then that Chloe delivered the coup de grace, not with shouted insults, but with a chilling, surgical precision that was far more devastating. "Oh, we know you are. It was just a very private moment. We only invited special people." Special people. The words hit her with the physical force of a sucker punch to the solar plexus, knocking the air from her lungs in a painful whoosh. Special people? She, who had been their human safety net, their silent, ever-flowing financial aquifer for 3 relentless years? She, who had set up an automatic transfer of $600 every single month, watching her own retirement fund slowly deplete to keep a roof over their heads in one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods. She had written a check for $1,500 for their Scandinavian living room set and another $800 last month because Chloe desperately needed a new designer dress for a very important event she'd been cryptic about. She had stocked their refrigerator with organic groceries when they were too busy to shop, paid the $1,200 bill for Daniel's root canal, and co-signed the loan for the Lexus they now drove. She had eaten canned soup and skipped her own hair appointments for 3 months to afford the $1,000 she had secretly set aside as their wedding gift. She was not a special person. She was a utility, a convenience, a line item in their budget labeled Mom. The bank of Mom, open 24/7 with no fees and no questions asked.
The thought was so degrading, so fundamentally shattering, that a hot flush of shame washed over her. Standing there in the heart of the home she had built with Robert, a home that now felt cavernous, echoing, and profoundly empty, Eleanor clutched the phone as if it were the last, only anchor in a suddenly violent and treacherous sea. She could see it all so clearly now, the pattern emerging from the fog of her own willful blindness like a sinister constellation, the evasiveness over the past few months when she asked about wedding dates, the vague answers about venues, the way Chloe's smile never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes when she uttered a perfunctory "thank you" for another check. She had been so busy paying for the scenery, she hadn't realized she'd been written out of the play. "Mom, are you still there?" Daniel's voice was a distant, irritating buzz, a fly knocking against a window pane in a room she was desperate to escape. "Yes," she managed, her own voice sounding thin, reedy, and ancient. The voice of a stranger. "I'm here. Congratulations again. I have to go. The dough, it's rising." She hung up before he could reply, the definitive click of the receiver echoing like a gunshot in the suffocating silence of the house. Her gaze, heavy with a grief she couldn't yet name, a compound of betrayal, humiliation, and a profound, soul-deep sadness, drifted across the room to the beautiful, useless lavender dress hanging in the open closet. It was not just a dress. It was a symbol of her hope, her inclusion, her maternal pride, the fantasy of standing next to her son, of fixing his tie, of sharing a look that said, "We did it, kid. We made it." Now it was just a $250 monument to her own breathtaking naivety, a flag of surrender she hadn't known she was waving. Driven by a morbid, self-flagellating curiosity, a need to sear the full, technicolor extent of her exclusion onto her soul, she stumbled toward her mahogany writing desk, Robert's desk, and opened her laptop. The machine whirred to life, its glow a cold, anemic light in the warm afternoon. Her fingers, clumsy and trembling with a Parkinsonian tremor she'd never noticed before, fumbled as she navigated to social media. And there it was. The proof she hadn't known she was searching for, laid out for the entire world to see, a public celebration of her private humiliation. The screen flooded with light and color and radiant, beaming faces. There was Chloe, stunning in a sleek, off-the-shoulder ivory gown, the dress, the one Eleanor had so willingly financed, thinking it was for a gala or an important work function. There was Daniel, handsome in a tailored, obviously expensive suit, his arm wrapped tightly around his new wife's waist, a wide, genuine, unburdened smile that he hadn't seen directed at her in years. And there, surrounding them, beaming with unadulterated pride and joy, were Chloe's parents, her two siblings, her best friends from college. They were photo after photo, toasting with flutes of champagne in a lush, sun-drenched garden at a vineyard in Napa Valley, laughing around a long wooden table laden with food at a beautifully decorated, intimate venue that was clearly not a courthouse, a close-up of their intertwined hands, gold wedding bands gleaming under the California sun. The caption, written by Chloe, read, "Officially Mrs. Carter, married my soulmate. So grateful to my amazing family and friends for sharing our perfect, intimate day with us. Hashtag happily ever after. Hashtag just married. Hashtag intimate wedding. Hashtag family is everything." Family is everything. The hypocrisy of the hashtag was a fresh, violent wave of nausea that rose in her throat, bitter and acrid. Eleanor scanned every face in every photograph, her heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She zoomed in, her vision blurring with unshed tears, searching for a glimpse of herself in the background, a shadow, anything. But she was not there. Not in a single shot. She had not been deemed worthy of a toast, a smile, A hug, a single solitary moment of their perfect day. The $800 dress, the $600 rent, the $1,500 sofa, the thousands upon thousands of dollars. It had all purchased her a front row seat to her own meticulously planned and executed erasure. She had funded her own oblivion. A sound escaped her, a raw, guttural thing that was half sob, half laugh of pure, undiluted irony. It was the sound of a foundation cracking, of the very narrative of her life splintering into 1,000 unrecognizable shards. For years, she had lived on a starvation diet of emotional crumbs, a perfunctory thank you card, a rushed phone call on her birthday, the fleeting, addictive illusion of being needed. She had mistaken financial dependency for emotional connection. She had been the perfect, generous mother, the obliging, silent mother-in-law, the reliable provider, all in the desperate, pathetic hope of buying a sliver of her son's love, of securing a place in his life, of filling the silence Robert had left behind. But those 4 poison-tipped words, "only invited special people," had torn away the veil with the brutality of a scalpel. They were not just an exclusion, they were a classification, a value assessment. They defined her place in their lives with brutal, unvarnished clarity. The bank of mom was welcome. Eleanor, the woman, the mother, the widow clutching the fragments of her family, was not. The pain was no longer a dull, familiar ache. It was a sharp, white-hot, clarifying anger. It was the anger of a woman who had finally seen the balance sheet of a one-sided relationship and found herself emotionally bankrupt. It was the anger of realizing that the legacy her hardworking husband had left to ensure her comfort and security in her golden years had been funneled directly into the lives of people who saw her as a temporary obstacle between them and the life they felt they deserved. She walked slowly to the window, looking out at the familiar, postcard-perfect view of the San Francisco skyline, but seeing none of it. The carefully constructed world of her retirement, built on the inheritance from Robert and her own lifelong, penny-pinch savings, was not a sanctuary. It had been a fuel depot, a pit stop, for a life that had no room for her in its passenger seat. The sourdough dough, now overproofing on the counter, was a grotesque monument to her foolishness. The lavender dress would go to a charity shop. The sourdough starter would be discarded down the sink. The bottle of champagne would be poured out. The $1,000 check would be torn into confetti-sized pieces. The hope she had clung to for so long, the hope that had sustained her through the lonely years after Robert's death, was finally, mercifully, dead. And in its place, something new was beginning to stir in the ashes of her heart. Something cold and hard and fiercely determined. It was the dawning understanding that the price of their love had been her very self, her dignity, her security, and she was no longer willing to pay. It was the first, quiet, resolute breath of a woman about to reclaim her life, her money, and her stolen identity. It was the beginning of the end of Eleanor, the human ATM. And it was the birth of Eleanor, the guardian of her own soul. There is a crucial difference between giving and being taken from. I spent 71 years learning how to be a giving mother, and only 7 days to realize I had been systematically taken from by my own son in the most sophisticated way possible. The Victorian house on Steiner Street was drowning in silence. Not the peaceful quiet of lazy Sunday mornings, but the heavy, suffocating silence that follows an explosion. Eleanor moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting her own life, her footsteps echoing through spaces that once resonated with laughter and love. Each room held memories that now felt like accusations. The formal dining room where she'd imagined hosting rehearsal dinners, the cozy parlor where she'd pictured opening wedding gifts with Daniel and Chloe, the kitchen where she'd tested recipes for the wedding cake that would never be served. The cheerful wedding to-do list remained stuck to the refrigerator, each item a fresh wound that refused to heal. Book photographer. She had spent weeks researching local artists, comparing portfolios late into the night. Choose centerpieces. She'd collected fabric swatches and flower samples, wanting everything to be perfect. Finalize menu. She'd cooked and discarded dozens of dishes, seeking the perfect balance between Daniel's comfort foods and Chloe's sophisticated palate. She couldn't bear to take it down. It stood as a monument to her naivety, a public display of her shattered dreams, a daily reminder of how thoroughly she had been erased from her son's life.
The lavender dress in her closet had transformed from a symbol of joy to a ghost at a funeral. She found herself standing before it in the dead of night, fingers hovering inches away as if the fabric were radioactive with betrayal. The delicate lace sleeves she'd once admired now looked like mourning veils. The elegant cut she'd thought so flattering now seemed like a costume for a play she'd never perform. She remembered the saleswoman's cheerful comment, "You'll look beautiful walking your son down the aisle." The memory was like a physical blow. What did I do to deserve this exclusion? The question echoed through the empty house, answered only by the phantom memory of Chloe's voice. Only special people. Those words played on a continuous loop in her mind, each repetition stripping away another layer of the beautiful fiction she'd called her relationship with her son. She found herself replaying every interaction, every conversation, looking for clues she had missed, signs she had ignored in her desperate desire to be loved and needed. The telephone became an instrument of psychological torture, its ring a jarring intrusion into her self-imposed isolation. When Daniel's name flashed on the screen, her heart would betray her with a painful lurch, that fleeting, desperate hope that he was calling to explain, to apologize, to say it was all a terrible misunderstanding and they wanted to include her after all. But hope immediately gave way to cold, sinking dread that he was calling to ask for something, to shatter the fragile shell of numbness she was building around herself. She let the machine answer, her body tensing with each recorded message. His voice, initially laced with thin concern, quickly sharpened with impatience. "Mom, pick up. We need to talk about the rent transfer. It didn't go through. The bank said it was canceled. The ATM was malfunctioning and needed immediate repair." Then, a few hours later, "Mom, this is getting serious. The landlord is threatening latezies. Just call me back so we can sort this out." The urgency wasn't about missing her, but about missing money. Then, Chloe's voice, a masterpiece of performed crisis. "Eleanor, please call Daniel back. The landlord was banging on the door this morning. We're under so much stress with the new marriage, and now this. You know we depend on you." The manipulation was so transparent now. The artificial panic, the manufactured emergency, the subtle guilt trip that had worked so well for years. She noticed how Chloe's voice always climbed an octave when asking for money, how she sprinkled in words like family and love only when financial needs arose. Their words provided the final, brutal confirmation. The world hadn't ended, their financial pipeline had merely sprang a leak, and they were there with duct tape. Annoyed at the inconvenience, their new married life had begun, and the first order of business was restoring the monthly subsidy. The pain transformed from a sharp cut to a deep, throbbing infection. A constant, sickening ache that made air feel thin and food taste like dust. She lost weight without trying, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. The lines on her face seemed to etch themselves deeper overnight, mapping the topography of her disappointment. She stopped answering the door, stopped checking mail, let the newspapers pile up outside. The world had become too bright, too loud, too full of happy families and loving relationships she could no longer bear to witness. On the seventh morning, Eleanor woke with a strange, cold clarity that felt both terrifying and empowering. The grief remained, a vast ocean inside her, but something new had emerged from its depths, a solid, unyielding resolve she didn't recognize. It was time to stop feeling like a victim and start acting like a forensic accountant of her own betrayal. It was time to look the monster in the eye, quantify it, and call it by its name. She approached Robert's old mahogany desk, feeling profound shame hot and prickly on her skin. This was where he had built their future with such care and wisdom, and she had dismantled it with such naive generosity. She remembered how he would sit here every Sunday evening, reviewing their finances, making sure they were secure. "This is for our future, Ellie," he'd say, his hand covering hers. "For our retirement, for Daniel's education, for whatever life brings." She had betrayed that careful planning, that sacred trust. She pulled out a fresh legal pad, the yellow pages seeming to judge her. The blank page was a courtroom, and she was about to testify against herself. She picked up Robert's favorite fountain pen, the heavy silver one he'd inherited from his father. It felt like both a sacrilege and a tribute to use it for this grim accounting. She began with the most obvious recurring transaction, the rent. $600 per month, 36 months. Her hand trembled as she wrote, $21,600. The figure pulsed on the page, alive with accusation. That alone represented a new car, a year traveling through Tuscany, visiting the vineyards she and Robert had dreamed of exploring in their retirement. It was the entire rainy day fund Robert had specifically left her, insisting she keep it for emergencies. It had been raining on Daniel and Chloe for 3 years, and she had handed them the entire umbrella, leaving herself exposed to the elements. Next came the beautifully furnished stage for their perfect exclusionary life. She closed her eyes and could see every detail of their apartment, the stage she had funded for her own humiliation. She remembered the shopping trips, Chloe's excited exclamations, Daniel's quiet acquiescence as she handed over her credit card again and again. The sleek gray sofa from Design Within Reach, $2,200. The minimalist oak dining table where she would never break bread, $1,500. The imported Italian leather armchair Chloe called an investment piece, $1,800. Rugs, lamps, coffee table completing the picture, $1,000. Total, $6,500. She had bought them the beautiful backdrop against which they'd staged her erasure. Then came the relentless, draining drip feed of gifts and emergencies that had become the background music of her financial life. Opening her laptop felt like opening a casket. Scrolling through 3 years of bank statements meant conducting a digital autopsy of her financial corpse. Each transfer, each check image represented a memory, a moment where she'd chosen their comfort over her own. The $800 for Chloe's important event dress, the wedding dress Eleanor hadn't been allowed to see her wear. The irony was so cruel it made her gasp aloud. The $1,200 for Daniel's root canal she'd paid without hesitation. The $400 for a much-needed Napa weekend for stress relief. The $300 for a new smartphone because Chloe's was practically antique and embarrassing. The $500 for urgent car repairs on the Lexus she'd co-signed for. The countless grocery top-ups, utility help, unexpected medical bills that always seemed to plague Chloe with mysterious regularity. She created categories, her pencils scratching against the paper with growing fury, as if she could excise the pain through sheer force of writing. The numbers began to tell a story far more damning than any wedding exclusion. Groceries and household, $200 a month times 36 months equals $7,200. Gifts and emergencies, a conservative estimate of $4,000. Car loan cosign, payments covered for a year, $4,800. Furniture and household items, $6,500. Rent subsidies,
$21,600. The numbers transformed from abstract figures into stolen pieces of her life. The $7,200 for their groceries was the Paris trip she kept postponing. The $4,000 in gifts was the new roof her historic home desperately needed. The $21,600 in rent was the financial security Robert had worked himself to an early grave to provide. Each dollar represented a choice she'd made to prioritize their wants over her needs, their comfort over her security.
Her breathing became shallow, the room tilting slightly. The total was coalescing into a sum so grotesque it felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. She added the final, most painful line items: the wedding gift she never gave, $1,000, and what she'd spent on her own now useless wedding attire and preparations, $250. The latter felt like adding insult to injury, paying for the privilege of her own humiliation. She put the pencil down, her hand shook uncontrollably. She took a deep, ragged breath and added the final column. Total, $38,150. The number hung in the silent room, monstrous and absolute. This wasn't just money. This was $38,150 worth of her love, her time, her labor, her security, her future, all translated into a currency they understood and exploited, then discarded. She saw Robert's face in the mahogany's grain. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, a single hot tear escaping and splashing onto the legal pad, blurring the ink of the final, damning number. "I gave them everything. I gave them our safety, our security, the future you worked so hard to build for us." It was in this state of raw, calculated clarity, a grief so deep it had looped back to terrifying serenity, that the phone rang again. Chloe. Eleanor didn't let it go to the machine. A strange calm descended. This was no longer a phone call. This was the first battle in a war she hadn't known she was enlisted in. "Eleanor, thank God." Chloe's voice was a symphony of performed desperation, each note perfectly calibrated to trigger Eleanor's maternal instincts. "The rent is overdue. The landlord was banging on the door. He's starting eviction proceedings. You forgot the transfer." Her voice cracked artfully on the last word, the performance so polished it was almost impressive. Eleanor remained silent, listening to the performance she'd fallen for so many times before. She looked at the number on the legal pad, $21,600. She saw all the canceled plans, the canned soup dinners, the years of walking on eggshells, hoping financial generosity would buy emotional connection. She remembered all the times she had rushed to the bank, putting their needs before her own medical appointments, her own social engagements, her own simple pleasures. "Chloe," Eleanor said, her voice terrifyingly calm, each word measured and precise. "Didn't I warn you? I only help special people." The silence on the other end was profound, broken only by a sharp intake of breath. The script had been torn up, the familiar dance steps forgotten. For the first time in their relationship, Chloe had no prepared response. "Eleanor, I don't understand," Chloe stammered, genuine confusion replacing practiced panic. "We are special to you. You're like a second mom to me. We love you." The words came out in a rushed, unconvincing torrent, the emotional manipulation so transparent it was almost pathetic. The lie was so brazen, Eleanor felt a grim smile touch her lips. It was the same voice that had asked for money for the wedding dress, the honeymoon, the rings she helped finance but never saw exchanged, the same saccharine tone reserved exclusively for financial requests. "Lies," Eleanor said softly, not to Chloe, but to the ghost of the woman she used to be, the woman who would have believed these empty professions of love. All lies, wrapped in pretty paper and delivered only when the bank account is empty. "Eleanor, please." The mask slipped completely now, revealing the steel beneath.
the impatient demand that had always been the true foundation of their relationship. "There is no please, Chloe," Eleanor said with unshakable finality, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You made your choice when you decided I wasn't special enough for your wedding day. When you excluded me from the most important day of my son's life, while happily spending my money to fund your celebration. Now I'm making mine." She placed the receiver back with a soft, definitive click that echoed through the silent house, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a single clear emotion cut through the grief and anger, rising like a phoenix from the ashes of her broken heart. Power. She picked up the legal pad. The $38,150 was no longer a record of exploitation, but a receipt for her liberation, a map that had led her out of the desert of her own endless giving. That money was the price she'd paid to finally see clearly, to understand the brutal economics of this so-called love. And as painful as the tuition had been, the education was priceless. She stood up, her body feeling both heavy with the weight of truth and light without the burden of illusion. She walked to the kitchen, her steps firm and determined. She took the bloated, sour-smelling sourdough starter, the physical manifestation of her dead hopes, the culture she had nurtured as carefully as she had nurtured her relationship with her son, and without ceremony, dropped it into the trash. It was time to stop feeding things that were dead, time to stop nourishing relationships that had been rotting from the inside for years. The war for her soul, for her future, for the legacy Robert left her, had begun with a single, quiet no. And as she looked out at the enveloping San Francisco fog, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that it was a war she was now ready to fight. Let them come with their guilt trips and their manipulations, their lawyers and their threats. She had finally found her battlefield, and for the first time in decades, she knew exactly who she was fighting for: herself. The silence in Eleanor's house on Steiner Street had transformed. It was no longer the hollow, grieving silence of the week following the wedding call, but a charged, anticipatory quiet, thick with the unspoken certainty of an approaching storm. Her simple, quiet no to Chloe had been a declaration of independence, a shot fired across the bow of their comfortable existence, and Eleanor knew with a cold, primal instinct that a counterattack was not just likely, it was inevitable. It arrived not with another pleading phone call, but with the jarring metallic sound of her own front door being unlocked and opened. The familiar click of the tumblers, a sound that had always meant welcome, now felt like a violation. Her heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs as Daniel, Chloe, and a man she did not recognize, a Dr. Fisher, as he would soon introduce himself with unctuous formality, walked into her home as if they owned it. They stood in her hallway, surrounded by the carefully curated artifacts of her life with Robert, the framed photographs, the inherited hall table, the worn Persian runner. Their presence an immediate desecration of her sanctuary. The air grew heavy with their uninvited energy. "Eleanor, thank God you're here," Chloe began, her voice a masterfully calibrated blend of concern and urgency. "We've been so worried. This is Dr. Fisher. He's a family law attorney we consulted about your situation." She let the word hang, pregnant with implication. "My situation." Eleanor's voice was dangerously quiet, a stark contrast to the roaring in her ears.
Daniel stepped forward, his face a strained mask of filial patience that was already cracking at the edges. "Mom, we went to the bank. Mr. Miller told us you canceled all the transfers. You blocked our access. We don't understand why you're doing this." His words were meant to sound wounded, but they carried the petulant, bewildered tone of a child whose unlimited allowance had been abruptly revoked. He was not looking at her as his mother, but as a malfunctioning service provider. Dr. Fisher approached, extending a hand that Eleanor pointedly did not take, letting her own hands remain clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Richter, your children are deeply concerned about your mental well-being. They report significant changes in your behavior.
Recent decisions like the abrupt financial cutoff and the installation of these, he gestured vaguely towards the discreet new security camera in the corner, rather excessive security precautions, suggest you might be under a strain that impairs your judgment. We are here to help. The audacity of it, the sheer polished gall, stole her breath for a moment. They had used a key given in love and trust to invade her privacy, and were now pathologizing her very rational act of self-preservation. Help? Eleanor's laugh was a short, sharp, mirthless sound that seemed to startle them. You mean like the help you offered when you tried to pressure me into signing a power of attorney? Is that the kind of help that involves declaring me mentally incompetent so you can manage the finances you feel entitled to? Mom, that's not fair, Daniel interjected, his voice rising with the whine she remembered from his teenage years. We have obligations, the rent, the car payments, the credit card you co-signed for. You can't just abandon us overnight. It's irresponsible. The word abandon was a spark on dry tinder, igniting a cold fury within her. Abandon you? She repeated, her own voice rising to a register of pure, unvarnished authority she hadn't used in years. I have paid the rent on an apartment I don't live in for 3 years. I have filled a refrigerator in a home where I am not welcome. I financed a wedding I was not special enough to attend. I have eaten canned soup and deferred my own dreams to ensure you could live beyond your means. Who has abandoned whom, Daniel? Tell me, when did I become nothing more than a line of credit to you? The room went still. Daniel looked as if he'd been slapped, his mouth slightly agape. It was then that Chloe played her final card. Her tears of pure, unadulterated frustration were now genuine. You can't do this to us, Eleanor. We were counting on you. We made plans, we bought things, we took on obligations because we knew we could count on you. Everything you have will belong to us one day anyway. We're just speeding up the process. There it was, the naked, unvarnished truth, laid bare in her own living room. In their minds, she was already dead, and they were merely collecting their inheritance in advance. The statement was so brutally honest, it momentarily silenced even Eleanor. Obligations based on my money, Eleanor stated, the clarity in her voice cold and absolute as ice. Not on my well-being, not on my happiness, not on my company, just my money. And now that I have decided that my money is better used in securing my own life and future, I am suddenly a confused, paranoid old woman who needs legal guardianship. How very convenient for you. Dr. Fisher, sensing the situation spiraling beyond his carefully prepared script, placed a slim, ominous black folder on her coffee table. Mrs. Richter, let's not be hyperbolic. We have prepared some documents here for a temporary power of attorney. It would simply allow Daniel and Lena to manage the more burdensome aspects of your finances. It would ease this transition. Eleanor looked at the folder, then at the three of them standing in a united front against her. Her only son, the woman who'd taken him from her, and their hired legal gun. She saw not a family, but a hostile takeover in progress. She saw the ghost of Robert's worried face in her mind. With a calm that felt superhuman, she picked up the folder and, without even glancing at its contents, dropped it directly into the trash can beside the desk. The thud it made was deeply satisfying. The only transition that is going to happen here is yours from my living room to the front door. All three of you, get out of my house. The battle lines were now irrevocably drawn. Their departure was not a retreat, but a strategic withdrawal, their faces a mixture of shock, fury, and a dawning fear. Eleanor stood firm by the door as they filed out, Dr. Fisher avoiding her gaze, Chloe shooting her a look of pure venomous hatred, and Daniel looking back at her with an expression of such profound betrayal that it almost broke her. Almost. When the door clicked shut, she engaged the new deadbolt, the solid, metallic thud echoing finality through the house. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood, her entire body trembling, not with fear, but with the aftershocks of a seismic personal earthquake. She had faced them down. She had drawn a boundary in steel. But she was not naive. This was only the beginning. The very next morning, she sat in the serene, oak-paneled office of Mr. Henderson, an attorney Margaret had recommended, a man known for his fierce dedication to protecting the rights of the elderly. As she recounted the previous day's invasion, her voice was steady, but the tremor had migrated to her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Henderson listened, his intelligent eyes missing nothing, his expression growing graver with each detail. What they attempted yesterday, Eleanor, is not just family drama. It is a classic, actionable case of elder financial abuse, he explained, his tone both reassuring and severe. The fact that they entered with a key you provided under the premise of familial trust and then used that access to pressure you into signing over financial control while simultaneously questioning your mental capacity constitutes a profound violation. We will document every single transaction, every interaction, and we will immediately begin the process of changing your will and estate plans to fortify your assets against any future manipulation. For 3 intense hours, they pored over her meticulously gathered financial records. Mr. Henderson let out a low, slow whistle when she showed him the final tally on the yellow legal pad. $38,150, he read aloud, shaking his head. Eleanor, with this sum, you could have traveled the world, lived comfortably for years, pursued any passion you desired. Instead, you completely financed the life of 2 able-bodied, employed adults who didn't even respect you enough to invite you to their own wedding. His words were not an accusation, but a powerful validation, a professional confirmation that cemented the reality of the profound injustice she had endured. Armed with a clear legal strategy, Eleanor began the practical work of fortifying her life. She hired a locksmith to replace every lock on her doors, the sound of the new heavy-duty deadbolt sliding into place a deeply satisfying symphony of security. She had Ethan, Mr. Summers' son, install a comprehensive security system with cameras at every entrance, not out of the paranoia they would claim, but as a rational, measured response to a demonstrated and credible threat. Her new neighbor, Margaret, became a quiet ally, a living witness to the fact that Eleanor was not a reclusive, confused woman, but one intelligently and courageously building necessary boundaries. Their friendship, built on shared coffee and quiet understanding, was a balm on her wounded soul. Yet the confrontation in her home had merely been a skirmish. The real war, she knew, was still to come. The calm she felt was the eye of the hurricane, and she was waiting, with a quiet, steely resolve, for the other side of the storm to hit. She had reclaimed her home, her money, and her voice. Now she would have to fight for the right to keep them. The days that followed were a strange interlude of peaceful preparation. Eleanor found solace in the simple, methodical acts of reclaiming her space. She went through Robert's old desk, not with grief this time, but with purpose, organizing documents and building the kind of paper trail,
Shredding old papers. She cleaned out closets, donating bags of clothes she no longer wore, making physical space as she was making emotional space. Each item she let go of felt like shedding a weight, a step lighter on her path to a new life. Margaret proved to be an unexpected source of strength. She was a widow of 10 years, with a daughter who had gone through a similar period of entitlement before finding her own way. They see us as caretakers of their inheritance, not as people with our own lives to live, Margaret said one afternoon over tea.
her eyes wise and kind. Setting boundaries isn't cruel, Eleanor. It's the only way to have a real relationship, if one is ever possible again. Eleanor began to venture out again, tentatively at first. She visited the art museum alone, something she hadn't done since Robert's passing, and found she enjoyed the silence, the ability to linger at a painting without feeling rushed. She signed up for a gardening class at the local community center, her hands digging into the soil, nurturing new life, a powerful counterpoint to the emotional devastation she had endured. But the peace was fragile. She noticed Daniel's car driving slowly past her house on several occasions. Sometimes it would park down the street for 10, 15 minutes at a time. She didn't feel afraid, watching him through her new security camera feed. She felt a profound sadness. This was her son, reduced to surveilling his own mother, not out of concern, but out of a desperate need to regain control of a resource he considered his. One evening, as she was reviewing her new will with Mr. Henderson, a document that now left the bulk of her estate to charities supporting elderly independence, her doorbell rang. The camera showed a well-dressed woman with a professional smile and a clipboard. "Mrs. Richter, I'm from Adult Protective Services. We've received a report concerning your welfare and need to conduct a wellness check." Eleanor's blood ran cold. They had escalated. This was no longer a private family matter. They had brought in the state. She took a deep breath, channeling the calm she had found in Margaret's friendship and Mr. Henderson's counsel. She knew this was just another battlefield in the war they had started, and for the first time she felt truly prepared to fight. The woman at her door thought she was checking on a vulnerable elder. She had no idea she was facing a warrior. The arrival of the social worker, a Miss Schmidt, from Adult Protective Services, was the confirmation Eleanor had been dreading yet expecting. The war had moved from her living room to the bureaucratic battlefield, and the stakes had been raised from financial control to her very liberty. Miss Schmidt stood on her porch, a picture of professional
Concern with her neat folder and practiced smile, but her eyes held the cool, assessing gaze of someone who had already been fed a narrative. Eleanor, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, did not let the fear take root. Instead, she heard Mr. Henderson's calm voice in her mind, "Do not answer questions without me. You have rights." She invited the woman in, her own posture one of quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the confused and paranoid woman described in the report Ms. Schmidt briefly flashed. "Mrs. Richter," Ms. Schmidt began, settling into Eleanor's armchair as if it were her own office, "we've received concerning reports from your family about significant changes in your behavior, sudden financial decisions, social isolation, installing unnecessary security measures. They're worried about your mental well-being." Every word was a carefully placed brick in the wall they were trying to build around her. Eleanor remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of composure. "Ms. Schmidt," she said, her voice even, "before this conversation proceeds, I need to call my attorney." A flicker of surprise, then impatience, crossed the social worker's face. "Mrs. Richter, this is just a wellness check. If you have nothing to hide, there should be no problem speaking with me. We're here to help." The phrase, "if you have nothing to hide," felt like a trap, a manipulative tool to pressure her into surrendering her privacy. "Your presence, based on false reports from individuals attempting to gain control of my finances, feels more like an interrogation than help. My attorney, Mr. Henderson, will be here shortly. You are welcome to wait." The 20 minutes it took for Mr. Henderson to arrive were the longest of Eleanor's life. She sat in silence, refusing to be baited by Miss Schmidt's probing questions about her medication, her sleep patterns, her reasons for cutting off Daniel. She simply repeated, "I will wait for my legal counsel." Each repetition felt like forging another link in the chainmail protecting her soul. When Mr. Henderson finally walked in, his presence was like a shield. He was calm, polite, but his authority filled the room.
Ms. Schmidt, he said, after reviewing her credentials, unless you have a court order, this constitutes harassment. My client is under my representation. The family you reference is the same one that attempted to coerce her into signing a power of attorney after breaking into her home. He placed his own, much thicker folder on the table. This is documented evidence of systematic financial and emotional abuse. $38,000 over 3 years. Social exclusion. Threats. The only person at risk here is my client, from her own son.
Eleanor watched as Miss Schmidt reviewed the documents, the bank statements, the list of gifts, the transcript of the confrontation. The woman's professional demeanor faltered. The one-sided story she had been given was crumbling under the weight of evidence. "Mrs. Richter," Miss Schmidt asked, her tone noticeably softer, "can you explain why you feel the need for such extensive security?" Eleanor looked her directly in the eye. "To protect myself from the people who filed that report. The same people who believe everything I have will be theirs one day anyway. Wouldn't you take precautions if your family saw you not as a person, but as an obstacle?" The wellness check ended with Miss Schmidt apologetically closing her file. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The mere fact that the state had been involved, that her competence had been officially questioned, left a stain. Mr. Henderson was grim. "They're getting desperate, Eleanor. A failed APS report is often a precursor to a legal petition for guardianship. They will try to have you declared incompetent in court." The prediction materialized 3 weeks later in the form of a formal lawsuit. Daniel and Chloe were petitioning the court to have a legal guardian appointed for her, alleging she was no longer capable of managing her own affairs. The weight of the document in her hands was physical, a stone of pure betrayal. Her own son was not just trying to take her money, he was trying to legally erase her personhood, to reduce her to a ward, a child in the eyes of the law. The preparation for the court battle became Eleanor's new, all-consuming purpose. With Mr. Henderson, she met Dr. Moore, a psychiatrist specializing in geriatric competency. The 2-hour evaluation was exhaustive. Memory tests, logic puzzles, questions about current events, and an in-depth discussion of her financial decisions. At the end, Dr. Moore smiled. "Mrs. Richter, your cognitive function is not just intact, it's exceptional. Your decision to stop financing 2 adults is not a sign of mental decline, it's a sign of sound judgment." Meanwhile, Daniel and Chloe's case was built on sand, and Mr. Henderson was a master architect of its demolition. He tracked down the pharmacist, Mr. Green, who was horrified to learn his name had been used. He provided a sworn affidavit stating Eleanor was a model customer who only bought vitamins and aspirin. The neighbor, Mr. Davis, when questioned under oath, had to admit his claims of paranoia were based on seeing workmen install cameras and strangers, Eleanor's new friends, visiting. He had never spoken to her directly. The day of the hearing arrived. Eleanor dressed with deliberate care in a simple, elegant navy suit. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw not a victim, but a claimant, a woman demanding the right to her own mind and life. The courthouse hallway was a study in contrasts. Daniel and Chloe stood with their lawyer, a picture of aggrieved concern. Eleanor stood with Mr. Henderson, and, to her surprise and profound gratitude, Margaret, who had come to offer silent support. In the courtroom, Daniel and Chloe's lawyer painted a tragic picture. A once generous mother, now isolated and manipulated, making irrational financial decisions that harmed their loving family. He called Chloe to the stand, and she performed beautifully, her voice breaking as she described the cold, hostile stranger Eleanor had become. But Mr. Henderson's cross-examination was a surgical strike. "Mrs. Schuster, when was the last time you and your husband took my client to dinner? Not a dinner where you asked for money, but simply to enjoy her company." The silence was telling.
Is it true that the hostile behavior began immediately after you excluded her from your wedding, a wedding she helped finance? Chloe's flustered response spoke volumes. Then it was Daniel's turn. Seeing her only son on the witness stand, swearing an oath to tell the truth before lying about her mental state, was a pain so acute it was almost transcendent. It severed the final, frayed thread of hope. This was no longer her child. This was an adversary. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice straining for sincerity, "we just want what's best for her. She's not herself." Mr. Henderson approached. "Mr. Richter, is a 35-year-old man who cannot pay his own rent without his 71-year-old mother's help in a position to determine what is best for the woman who raised him alone?" The question hung in the air, its answer a silent condemnation. When it was their turn, Mr. Henderson presented not just a defense, but a counter-narrative. He presented the financial evidence, the clear pattern of exploitation. He called Dr. Moore, who authoritatively dismantled the claims of incompetence. He called Mr. Green, who clarified the medication issue. He even called Mr. Summer from the hardware store, who testified that Eleanor had been clear-headed and decisive when ordering her new locks.
Finally, Eleanor took the stand. She was not asked to recite numbers or dates. Mr. Henderson simply asked her to tell her story, and she did. She spoke not with bitterness, but with a profound, weary sadness that commanded the room's respect. She spoke of love that had been measured in dollars, of hope that had been weaponized against her, and the moment she realized that special people was a term of financial, not emotional value. "Mrs. Richter," Mr. Henderson asked softly in his closing, "what did you learn from adding up all those numbers, the $38,000? She looked not at him, but at Daniel. "I learned the price of my own freedom, and that it was worth every penny." The judge's ruling was swift. He denied the petition for guardianship in its entirety, stating that Eleanor had demonstrated remarkable clarity and sound judgment, and that the evidence strongly suggested the lawsuit was motivated by the petitioner's financial interests rather than genuine concern. Walking out of the courthouse, Eleanor felt neither triumph nor joy. She felt a vast, hollowed-out peace. It was over. The war was won. Daniel looked at her one last time, and in his eyes she saw the ghost of the boy she had loved, now forever lost behind the man he had chosen to become. That night, surrounded by Margaret and a few of her new friends from her gardening class, Eleanor allowed herself to feel the full weight of the victory. It was not a celebration of defeating her son, but a mourning of his loss and a baptism for her new life. She had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged not broken, but unshackled. The law had confirmed what she had already known in her bones. Her mind was her own, her life was her own, and her future was a blank canvas waiting for her to paint it with colors of her own choosing. The silence in her house that night was no longer charged or anticipatory. It was simply, beautifully, peaceful. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor began the delicate process of dismantling the life she had known and building anew. The first and most significant step was selling the Victorian house on Steiner Street. It was no longer a home filled with memories, but a museum of grief and betrayal. Each room held the echo of Robert's absence and the more recent, sharper memory of Daniel's treachery. When the sold sign went up, it felt less like a loss and more like an exorcism. With Margaret's steadfast support, she found a modern, sun-drenched apartment in a vibrant neighborhood, a place with no history, where every memory made would be hers alone. She used a portion of the proceeds from the house to fulfill a promise she had made to herself during the darkest days of the legal battle. She booked a trip to Paris, standing before the Eiffel Tower not as a wistful dreamer, but as a woman who had fought for her right to be there. She felt a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes.
She walked along the Seine, visited the Louvre, and sat in quiet cafes, simply watching the world go by. The $38,150 had bought her this freedom, and in that moment, every cent of that painful tuition felt worth it. Back in San Francisco, she became a regular at the community center, not just in the gardening class, but in a painting workshop. Her canvases, once timid and unsure, began to burst with bold, confident colors, vibrant blues and golds that reflected the new light in her soul. She donated a significant sum to a local charity that provided legal aid to seniors facing financial exploitation, transforming the instrument of her pain into a shield for others. She never heard from Daniel or Chloe again. Occasionally, through the faint whispers of mutual acquaintances, she heard they had been forced to move to a smaller apartment, that Chloe had finally taken a job. There was no schadenfreude in the news, only a quiet, distant pity. They had chosen money over love, and in doing so, had lost both. The adversity they now faced was the teacher her generosity had failed to be. Some evenings, Eleanor would stand on her new balcony, a glass of wine in hand, looking out at the glittering tapestry of the San Francisco city lights. The woman who had wept over a sourdough starter and a lavender dress felt like a character from someone else's story. She had been refined by fire, and what emerged was stronger, clearer, and unafraid. She had learned the most valuable lesson of her 72 years, that true love is never transactional, and freedom, no matter the cost, is the only currency that truly matters. Her story was no longer about what had been taken from her, but about the boundless, beautiful life she had courageously reclaimed.
Childhood laughter that had once rung through the halls, but those sweet memories were now overshadowed by the ghost of Chloe's cutting words in the living room, the spectral presence of Dr. Fisher and his ominous folder. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene of her emotional betrayal. With Margaret's unwavering support, she found a realtor and began the process. Packing was an archaeological dig through her own history. She did not rush. She allowed herself to feel the grief for what was lost, the joy for what had been, and the sharp sting of what had been broken beyond repair. She kept only what brought her peace: Robert's desk, a few cherished photographs, her favorite books. The rest, the lavender dress, the unused wedding guest book, the sourdough recipe card, she let go of, item by item, releasing the weight of expectation and disappointment. She found a new home not in another grand, lonely house, but in a bright, modern apartment in a neighborhood pulsing with life. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in California sun, and a small balcony that offered a breathtaking view of the Golden Gate Bridge. It was a view that spoke not of the past, but of possibility, of journeys yet to be taken. Margaret helped her arrange the furniture, her presence a quiet testament to the fact that family could be forged from friendship and mutual respect. The first night she spent there, surrounded by boxes and the unfamiliar sounds of a new building, Eleanor felt a thrill of anticipation, not a pang of loneliness. The silence here was different. It was hers, untainted by the echoes of conflict. With the proceeds from the house, she made a decision that felt like the purest expression of her hard-won autonomy. She booked a solo trip to Paris. It was the journey she and Robert had always dreamed of, the one she had perpetually postponed. The money for it always funneled into Daniel and Chloe's endless emergencies. As the plane lifted off from San Francisco, she watched the city shrink beneath her, a physical manifestation of leaving her old life behind. In Paris, she was nobody's mother, nobody's mother-in-law, nobody's bank account. She was simply Eleanor. She spent her days wandering without agenda. She got lost in the winding streets of Montmartre, sat for hours sketching in the Luxembourg Gardens, and stood in quiet awe before the stained glass glory of Sainte-Chapelle. One afternoon, she treated herself to an extravagant lunch at a left bank bistro, savoring every bite of perfectly cooked steak frite and a glass of rich Bordeaux.
The $38,150 she had calculated on a yellow legal pad now translated into this moment of unadulterated joy and freedom. It was the best money she had ever spent. Upon her return, brimming with a new sense of purpose, she immersed herself in building a life that was authentically hers. She enrolled in a proper painting class, investing in quality oils and canvases. Her early works were tentative, but as weeks turned into months, her brushstrokes grew bolder, her color palette more vibrant.
Painted the deep blues of the San Francisco Bay, the fiery gold of a Marin County sunset, and abstract explosions of color that represented the tumultuous, liberating emotions she had endured. Her art was no longer a hobby, it was therapy, a testament to her resilience. Her transformation extended beyond her personal pursuits. She contacted Mr. Henderson once more, not for defense, but for offense. She revised her will, leaving the bulk of her estate to charities dedicated to preventing elder financial abuse and supporting senior independence. She also established a small scholarship fund for returning adult students at the local community college. In doing so, she transformed the legacy of her exploitation into a force for good, ensuring that her money would empower others rather than enable dependency. It was the ultimate reclamation of her narrative. She never heard from Daniel or Chloe again. The silence was absolute. Occasionally, through the faint, impersonal grapevine of mutual acquaintances, she heard snippets. They had been evicted from their Hayes Valley apartment, they had moved to a cheaper city, Chloe had finally been forced to get a full-time job. Eleanor felt no vindication, only a distant, profound sadness. They had been offered love and had chosen to see only currency. The adversity they now faced was the harsh teacher her endless generosity had failed to be. She hoped, for their sake, that they would learn from it. But she knew their journey was no longer her concern. The cord had been cut not by her, but by their own actions, and she felt no obligation to tie it back together. Her life now was rich with connections of her own choosing. Her friendship with Margaret deepened into a true sisterhood. They traveled together to the wine country, spent weekends browsing farmers markets, and became each other's emergency contacts, a title that held more weight and genuine care than any familial obligation. Eleanor's circle grew to include other women from her art class, a diverse group who valued her for her wit, her wisdom, and her newly discovered strength, not for what she could provide materially. One evening, as she stood on her balcony watching the lights of the Bay Bridge begin to twinkle against the twilight sky, a profound sense of contentment settled over her. The woman who once measured her worth by her usefulness to others was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that her value was intrinsic. The $38,150 had been the painful tuition for the most valuable lesson of her 72 years, that love, when real, is a gift given freely, never a debt to be repaid, and that personal freedom is the ultimate wealth, a prize worth any fight. Her story was no longer defined by the betrayal, the lawsuit, or the money she had lost. It was defined by the life she had courageously built from the ashes. She had faced the deepest pain a mother can endure, and had emerged, not hardened, but softened, not broken, but whole in a new way. She had learned to mother herself. Looking out at the endless horizon, Eleanor Richter finally knew, with every fiber of her being, that her most meaningful chapters were not behind her. They were just beginning, and she was ready to live them on her own terms, in the beautiful, unburdened silence of her own peace.